here today with Arthur Hollman, a distinguished cardiologist, archivist to the British Cardiovascular Society and curator of the Arthur Hollman collection, examples of which we'll see later on in this interview. Arthur, welcome. Maybe we could start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your training and career in cardiology.
Well, Ian, I was a medical student at UCH in 1944 when I had the good fortune to be on the firm of Sir Thomas Lewis, the very famous cardiologist. So I got an introduction to cardiology really at that time. And then as a houseman, I worked on the rheumatic fever unit at Taplow, and the visiting cardiologist there was the very well-known cardiologist, Dr. Paul Wood, and he introduced me to right heart catheterization. So I did several right heart catheters when I was really quite junior, actually, aged about 26 or something like that. Then back to UCH for a while, then something very important, becoming senior registrar at Hammersmith Hospital to Professor John Goodwin, which was a very exciting and important time for Hammersmith and for British cardiology in general, because Dennis Melrose had just invented the first British heart-lung machine, and they were just starting to do open heart surgery when I arrived. So I was detailed off to be the cardiologist to the surgical team. I spent a lot of my time in the operating room and even went to Moscow with them when the surgeons in Moscow wanted to learn how to do open heart surgery and to use the Melrose machine to do it. Then back to UCH for about 20 years, where I particularly enjoyed the teaching. And then 1989 I retired, but then had the equally good fortune to become associated with the Conquest Hospital in Hastings, where we have medical students from King's in London and from the New Brighton Medical School. So I started teaching the students there, and I'm teaching them to this day.
And what advice would you have for young doctors pursuing a career in cardiology today?
To start off with, I would advise them very strongly to get general training in cardiology, not to try and specialize too early, get as much broad experience as they possibly can before they inevitably have to specialize. When you do specialize, choose something that you enjoy doing, because you're going to have to do that for the next 30 years of your life. Don't forget that academic cardiology is important. You may end up being a British Heart Foundation professor. And also within cardiology, just remember that interventional cardiology is not the only subject that is worthy of your attention.
And maybe you could tell us about the extent of the collection, what it involves, and why you think it's so important.
Well, going back to UCH, when Thomas Lewis's successor eventually retired, there was a lot of equipment belonging to Lewis that was left lying around, and to avoid it being dispersed, I collected some of it together. Some of it I gave to the Science Museum, but luckily I kept some of it. So when I was appointed archivist to the British Cardiovascular Society 20 years ago, this equipment was available, so it formed the nucleus of a collection of old cardiologic equipment in the Cardiac Society headquarters.
And maybe you could give us a brief tour of some of the interesting things you've collected over the years.
Yes, well, it would be a pleasure, Ian, to show you some of the pieces, and we have them here today.
So Arthur, thank you very much for the interview, and it's great to be able to look at some of the pieces in the historical collection. What would you like to show us first?
Perhaps we'll start, Ian, with the recording apparatus, which was developed towards the end of the Victorian era, starting with the sphygmograph, which was designed by Robert Dudgeon in 1882, which was a very nice way of recording the arterial pulse on a piece of smoked paper. You put the recording apparatus onto the radial artery, and the moving arm inscribed a very nice recording of the radial pulse. So that was very useful for many years for recording arrhythmias.
And extraordinary, really, that the arterial pulse is so well defined.
It looks good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Very good.
Very impressive.
And then Sir James Mackenzie, the doyen of 20th century British cardiology, devised an apparatus where two channels were recorded. One was the arterial, which we've already seen, and the other was the venous. So now recording right and left heart together. Mackenzie then went on to invent a device for recording the same things but with ink writing. So that was Mackenzie's ink writing polygraph of 1906. And then finally that was modified by Thomas Lewis at UCH in 1914 to produce the Mackenzie-Lewis ink writing polygraph. You can see the recordings here of the venous and arterial pulses, and we have a recording here done with that apparatus, in fact by myself, in 1950. So although the electrocardiogram had already been invented, this was still a very good way of recording arrhythmias because it was a very portable piece of apparatus. You could easily take it to the patient's home. Well, we've just seen the mechanical recordings of the heartbeat, which were good, but of course people had to deduce impulse formation from it. So the goal was to record the electrical activity of the heart, which was already known about in animals. And this was first achieved in the humans by Augustus Waller at St Mary's Hospital, London, 1887. And we're very fortunate indeed in having Waller's original 1887 apparatus in our museum, and this is it. A beam of light was shone onto a photographic plate on this board from a thing called a capillary electrometer, and as the beam of light wiggled up and down, recording the electrocardiogram, these little miniature train moved across and recorded the electrocardiogram. So this is Waller's original description in the Journal of Physiology for 1887, and the lower tracing is the electrocardiogram. It only shows two waves. One is the R wave and the other is the T wave, but that's the first ever human electrocardiogram, and that's the original apparatus. And then Eindhoven in Leiden in 1901 invented the modern electrocardiogram with an apparatus called the string galvanometer. The Cambridge Instrument Company produced the first clinical electrocardiograph in 1910, and that was used by Thomas Lewis to analyze many arrhythmias. The recordings, the tracings made with it were of superb quality, as you can see on this. On the left-hand side, standard limb leads on a dog's heart with sinus rhythm, and on the right-hand side, after bundle branch block had been produced. Quite a bit later, in 1929, the Cambridge Instrument Company produced their portable electrocardiograph. And again, we're very fortunate in having one of the original models of that, which was donated to us by Dr. Patrick Cadigan.
And this is it here, Arthur, is it not?
This indeed is it, a complete 1929 electrocardiograph. It may be the only one in existence outside of a museum. And we can notice that, of course, in those days it was just producing only the standard limb leads, but of very high quality. And in addition to recording the electrocardiogram, one also could put mechanical events on it by having a tambour in the beam of light. So there we can see the electrocardiogram with venous pulses. And the Cambridge Company produced over 2,000 models of this, and it was used worldwide.
And I guess one of the aspects of the collection is that the equipment that we're using today is, of course, the historical collection of tomorrow. So it's very important that we keep going in terms of building the collection for the future.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Ian, because I don't think that many people who are practicing cardiology today realize that their equipment, which we want now, in 50 years' time, will be completely antique. And people will be wondering, whatever did they use these things for?
So if anyone does have equipment, you're the person to contact at
Please.
the Society, Arthur.
It's always
and,
very welcome indeed, and I should say that the members of the British Cardiovascular Society have been exceptionally generous in donating their own equipment to our museum, and we're very grateful to them for doing that.
And thank you, Arthur, for giving us a very valuable insight into the Arthur Hollman Historical Collection.
It's a pleasure.